Thanks very much, Federico, and really great to have been invited to be here. So I'm going to share, I think the instructions I had from Fernando was to choose a paper that influenced your career. So I'm going to do that and have no conflicts of interest. So I'm going to begin with there I am as a young junior doctor just starting as a registrar at Great Ormond Street in 1978, 79, working not in infectious disease, but in nephrology and intensive care. And Bill Marshall, who everyone here knows the name of through the Bill Marshall Award, was the only infectious disease doctor specialized in infectious disease in the UK and the only infectious disease consultant at Great Ormond Street. And I received a phone call from Bill one night when I was on call as the intensive care registrar to come to see a 4-year-old girl who had been transferred to Great Ormond Street. And she had recently arrived from Pakistan. She was comatose, she was shocked, she had an unrecordable blood pressure. She had a diffuse erythematous rash. She had red conjunctiva, she had ulcerated mouth and lips, she was tachypneic, distended abdomen, she had mild desquamation, she had a cold periphery, she was anuric, she had low platelets, she was anemic, virtually everything was going wrong. And Bill asked me to come and see her on his ward. And I came down, we started fluids and inotropes, and we put her on a ventilator, and I started dialysis. And we didn't have a clue what was wrong with her, because everything was going wrong. We wondered, could this be dengue? Could this be hemolytic uremic syndrome? Could it be sepsis? Could it be Reye's syndrome? And that is what she looked like. So this is after we'd started dialysis and on a ventilator, and there's the red lips with some desquamation going on around it. And a few days later, the peeling of her skin. And I'd spent the whole night up with this child, and at about 4 o'clock in the morning, I wandered into the coffee room to get some coffee, and there lying on the table in the coffee room was a copy of The Lancet from November 25, 1978. And I came across in that paper the heading, and I looked at the paper, and there was Jim Todd's a wonderful pediatrician in Denver, Colorado, who wrote the world's first description of the staphylococcal toxic shock syndrome. And most people think of toxic shock as a disease of menstruating women and don't know it was described in children. And as I read his summary, 7 children presenting with high fever, headache, conjunctival hyperemia, scarlet teniform rash, edema, vomiting, watery diarrhea, disseminated intravascular coagulation, severe shock. 1 patient died, 1 developed gangrene. And 5 patients were studied, and he noted Staphylococcus aureus, and it was isolated from mucosal surfaces and not from the blood. And I read this paper, and it seemed to fit every feature of the child I'd spent all night looking up on. So in the ward round in the morning, I announced that I thought we had a diagnosis for the child, and it was the staphylococcal toxic shock syndrome. And this is the graph of the first cases, Jim Todd's papers, and then the disease took off when it became associated with menstruation and became known as the menstrual toxic shock syndrome. So Jim Todd's paper was completely remarkable because it described with absolute clarity and with beautiful writing all the clinical features. There's very little that has been added to it in the hundreds of papers since. Not only did he describe the disorder, but he recognized that it might be mediated by a toxin. He made the link with Staphylococcus, and I was just thinking in one paper to have come up with both a new disease, a etiology, and a mechanism. And he then visited Bill Marshall some time after this, and I met him, and I decided to go and study under him in Denver. So his paper led to a change in my career. I was then a nephrology trainee, and I became an infectious disease trainee. But the influence of this on me did not stop there because, why can't I get the, because of this diagnosis, I became Bill Marshall's go-to person because I'd made the diagnosis on this child. He suddenly thought of me as the person to come and see all the children with fever and red rash. And I'd get a phone call from Bill, and I don't know if any of people who know him, but he wasn't somebody you argued with. And I'd get a phone call at home on a Sunday morning at 7 o'clock in the morning, and Bill would say, "Why are you in bed? And why are you not coming to take blood from this child with the first cases of Kawasaki disease?" And that comes to the second paper I'm going to talk about, which is Dr. Kawasaki's amazing description of Kawasaki disease. And Bill Marshall couldn't have read the paper because it was in Japanese at that stage. It hadn't been translated into Japan, but there was an English language translation, and Bill was the first person in the UK to start diagnosing the disease. And it was only later that the paper was translated into English and became accessible to pediatricians over. But it is truly a remarkable description of the disease. And what was beautiful is that Dr. Kawasaki illustrated by hand every single patient. Every single patient is clearly shown with diagrams of where the rash was, with everyone will now be familiar with the timing of the disease, of when the lymphadenopathy happened, when the rash happened, when the desquamation, and what was happening to the fever and the blood results and so on. And Jane Burns's commentary to the publication of the English language translation, she said it beautifully. In his exhaustive detailing of every observable aspect of the disease, Kawasaki was part Sherlock Holmes and part Charles Dickens, with his sense of mystery and his vivid description of the clinical features. So a truly remarkable advance. And both Jim Todd's in making Bill Marshall pull me into infectious diseases, but Dr. Kawasaki's description dragged me into working on Kawasaki disease because I'd been studying immune complexes in nephrology, and Bill pulled me into working on how the mechanism might be involved in Kawasaki disease. And I wrote my very first scientific paper with Bill Marshall as the last author. And sadly, this paper was the last paper Bill Marshall published because he died soon after it was published. And so these two papers, Jim Todd's description of the staphylococcal toxic shock syndrome and Dr. Kawasaki's description of Kawasaki, they have in common that they were both remarkable examples of an astute pediatrician making careful clinical observation on their patients and describing a disease that no one had previously recognized. And in both papers, it was the careful detail, the choice of words that made everyone have a clear picture who read these papers of the diseases they were describing. Both of these papers changed the direction of my career, gave me a long-term interest in the febrile and red rash diseases and shock and the mechanisms of disease. And both Jim and Dr. Kawasaki have been role models of how to be a clinical investigator, how to be a pediatrician. Both are amazingly generous in their support of young people. And I think Dr. Kawasaki carried on going to the Kawasaki meetings into his 90s. And Jim Todd has been a remarkable presence and mentor to many of us in pediatric infectious diseases. So I want to end by saying that these papers changed pediatrics because they gave us diseases we didn't know about, and they were remarkable influences on many clinicians, and particularly myself. So thanks, Dr. Kawasaki and Jim Todd, for opening up these amazing diseases to ongoing clinical research and clinical care, and the influence you've had on all of us. So thank you.